The 1980 Mr. Olympia rewrites the rules overnight. In 1980, competitive bodybuilding experienced a structural shock that permanently altered how winners were perceived and how power operated behind the scenes. The Mr. Olympia 1980 was expected to be a battle between established, active competitors who had prepared for months under known judging criteria. Days before the contest, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who had publicly retired years earlier, entered the competition with no prior announcement to the field. This was not simply a surprise appearance. Arnold arrived with a physique that, by prevailing standards of the time, was not the most conditioned, the most symmetrical, or the most detailed. Several competitors displayed sharper definition and more complete preparation. Despite this, Arnold won decisively. The judging process itself raised alarms. Judges reportedly cast votes almost immediately, leaving no visible deliberation. Several athletes protested openly, and at least one competitor exited the stage area in protest. The controversy stemmed from the perception that fame, influence, and institutional power outweighed the published judging criteria. This event introduced a lasting shift. Bodybuilding outcomes were no longer viewed as the product of physique comparison alone. From this point forward, athletes, fans, and sponsors began to understand that reputation, politics, and organizational relationships could override objective evaluation. The 1980 Olympia established that the rules of bodybuilding were flexible, and that flexibility favored those with power. The mass monster era replaces aesthetics without warning. In the early 1990s, competitive bodybuilding underwent a sharp and largely unannounced transformation in what judges rewarded on stage. Prior to this shift, winners were typically selected based on symmetry, balance, proportion, and visual flow between muscle groups. Size mattered, but it was constrained by aesthetic standards. This expectation collapsed with the rise of Dorian Yates. Beginning in 1992, Yates presented a physique that was dramatically different from his predecessors. He carried unprecedented muscle density, extreme back thickness, and a level of overall mass never before rewarded at the highest level. His physique lacked some of the sweeping lines and classical proportions that previously defined champions. Yet he won decisively. Judges did not announce a change in criteria. Rulebooks were not updated. However, the outcomes made the new standard clear. Muscle mass and density had overtaken symmetry as the primary determinants of victory. Competitors who maintained aesthetic builds found themselves non-competitive almost immediately, regardless of conditioning or presentation. This shift forced athletes to respond. Training styles became heavier and more injury-prone. Nutrition escalated to extreme caloric intake. Drug protocols intensified as competitors chased size to remain viable. The sport did not gradually evolve into this model. It pivoted abruptly based on repeated judging decisions. The plot twist was structural. Bodybuilding did not merely gain a new champion, it adopted a new identity. From that moment forward, physiques that would once have been considered excessive became the benchmark, permanently redefining what it meant to be elite in professional bodybuilding. A defeated champion proves the title was never permanent. In 2006, bodybuilding reinforced a long-standing assumption. Once a Mr. Olympia title is lost, it is almost never regained. Jay Cutler had won the Olympia multiple times through sheer size and conditioning, but his reign ended when judges favored a sharper, more detailed look. The loss appeared definitive. Historically, former champions who were dethroned either retired or remained contenders without reclaiming the title. Cutler did neither. Instead of exiting, he rebuilt his competitive approach. He adjusted training emphasis toward detail and separation, refined his conditioning strategy, and corrected visual weaknesses that had cost him the title. This was not a cosmetic change. It required altering years of muscle development patterns, peaking strategies, and presentation timing. In 2007, Cutler returned to the Olympia stage and won back the title. This outcome violated a core belief in bodybuilding, that judging momentum only moves forward and never reverses. The judging panel effectively admitted that the previous year's decision had not permanently defined Cutler's standing. The plot twist was not merely personal. It changed competitive psychology across the sport. Athletes learned that a title loss did not equal disqualification from future dominance. Judges demonstrated that prior outcomes could be overwritten if a physique met evolving expectations. This moment redefined what defeat meant in professional bodybuilding. A loss was no longer a career endpoint. It became evidence that judging standards were fluid, and that adaptation, not legacy, determined who could stand at the top again. Radical steroid transparency fails to protect the athlete. In the mid-2010s, bodybuilding experienced a reversal of a long-standing unwritten rule. Competitors never publicly discussed drug use. Rich Piana openly violated that norm by detailing the substances, dosages, and timelines commonly used at the professional level. This transparency was framed as educational, intended to expose the reality behind elite physiques and reduce misinformation. The expectation was that honesty would produce a corrective effect. Fans would better understand limits, younger athletes would make informed choices, and the industry would move towards safer practices. None of this occurred. Instead, transparency normalized extreme protocols. Rather than discouraging imitation, disclosure removed uncertainty and lowered the psychological barrier to experimentation. Sponsors and platforms initially benefited from the attention. View counts surged, brand reach expanded, and a new audience was drawn to bodybuilding through raw disclosure. However, this exposure created an unintended consequence. Drug use was no longer implicit. It was instructional. The absence of visible short-term consequences reinforced the belief that outcomes were manageable. When health complications and eventual death followed, the narrative shifted abruptly. Transparency did not protect the individual who disclosed, nor did it meaningfully reduce risk behavior across the community. The information outpaced the ability of viewers to contextualize danger. The plot twist was structural. Honesty, once assumed to be a safeguard, became a catalyst. The bodybuilding ecosystem absorbed transparency without reforming incentives, leaving the underlying risk profile unchanged, while accelerating participation in high-risk behavior. Sudden deaths exposed the cost of the modern physique. The deaths of high-profile professional bodybuilders created a rupture between how the sport was marketed and how it functioned internally. For decades, elite bodybuilding promoted narratives of discipline, control, and mastery over the body. This framing collapsed when multiple athletes died unexpectedly, while still actively competing or shortly after retiring. Among the most impactful cases were Dallas McCarver, Cedric McMillan, and Sean Roden. These were not marginal competitors. They were title contenders, fan favorites, and faces of the modern era. Their physiques represented the exact standards judges were rewarding at the highest level. When they died, the assumption that elite conditioning equaled health became impossible to sustain. Medical discussions that had long been confined to private circles entered public view. Cardiac enlargement, organ strain, blood pressure dysregulation, and long-term pharmaceutical load were no longer abstract risks. They were directly connected to recognizable outcomes. Importantly, none of these deaths resulted in immediate structural reform. Judging standards did not change, qualification systems remained intact, and drug testing protocols stayed limited. The plot twist was not the deaths themselves, but the response. The sport absorbed the losses without altering incentives. Fans were left to reconcile admiration with consequence, while competitors learned that mortality did not disqualify a physique from being rewarded. This moment clarified a central reality. Bodybuilding could acknowledge tragedy without changing direction, revealing that success and survival were no longer aligned goals. Mr. Olympia winners disappear. After reaching the peak, winning the Mr. Olympia title is commonly assumed to be the beginning of long-term dominance, financial security, and increased influence within bodybuilding. In practice, several champions experienced the opposite outcome. After winning the sport's highest title, they rapidly lost visibility, sponsorship support, or competitive relevance. The title did not stabilize their careers. It exposed how fragile post-victory status could be. In some cases, legal or personal issues abruptly removed champions from competition. In others, shifting judging standards rendered their winning physiques obsolete within a single season. Sponsors, whose support is driven by visibility rather than legacy, redirected resources to emerging contenders. Media attention followed suit. The champion, once central to the sport's narrative, became peripheral almost immediately. This pattern revealed a structural flaw. Bodybuilding lacked a system that converted championship success into durable career security. There were no guaranteed contracts, pensions, or long-term promotional commitments tied to winning. The title functioned as a temporary spotlight rather than a stable platform. The plot twist lies in the realization that victory increased exposure without increasing protection. Champions became more visible, but more insulated from decline. Once their physique no longer aligned with current judging preferences or public momentum, the system moved on without resistance. This outcome reframed the Mr. Olympia title not as an endpoint, but as a brief apex followed by rapid uncertainty. Winning did not secure a future. It merely intensified the consequences of losing relevance afterward. Fan outrage fails to change. Judging outcomes. As bodybuilding entered the social media era, it became widely assumed that fan reaction would begin to influence competitive outcomes. Loud crowd responses, online backlash, and widespread criticism were expected to pressure judges into reconsidering controversial decisions. This assumption collapsed during repeated title defenses by Phil Heath. particularly in contests where a large portion of the audience believed Kai Green presented a superior overall package. In multiple Olympia contests, Heath was awarded victory despite visible crowd dissatisfaction. Booing occurred during comparisons, social media criticism spiked immediately after decisions, and post-event analysis overwhelmingly favored Green in specific areas such as structure, flow, and visual impact. None of this altered official outcomes. Judging criteria emphasized muscle roundness, density, and completeness, areas where Heath consistently scored highly. However, the lack of transparency in scoring prevented fans from understanding how specific traits were weighted. Without score breakdowns or justification, decisions appeared insulated from public accountability. The plot twist was institutional. The sport demonstrated that audience approval was not a controlling factor. Judges answered to federation standards, not fan sentiment. Social media amplified disagreement, but did not translate into influence. This moment clarified a fundamental truth about professional bodybuilding. Popularity does not override judging authority. The audience could protest, analyze, and criticize, but outcomes were decided within a closed system. The belief that fan pressure could correct perceived injustice proved false. The bubble gut look becomes a winning trait. For decades, a tight midsection was considered non-negotiable in elite bodybuilding. Visible abdominal control, a narrow waist, and the ability to maintain vacuum poses were treated as core indicators of conditioning and discipline. This expectation collapsed gradually, then decisively, as visibly distended abdomens began appearing and winning on the biggest stages. The distension was not body fat. It was the result of internal enlargement caused by prolonged use of growth hormone, insulin, extreme caloric intake, and sustained organ stress. Unlike subcutaneous fat, this expansion could not be fully controlled by dieting or posing. It altered silhouettes permanently. Initially, this look was criticized. Fans and commentators labeled it unaesthetic and unhealthy. However, judging outcomes contradicted that criticism. Athletes with pronounced abdominal distension continued to place highly if they presented overwhelming size, density, and muscle maturity elsewhere. The judging message became clear. Midsection control was now a secondary concern. This shift forced adaptation. Competitors stopped prioritizing waist control once it no longer affected placements. Training and pharmaceutical strategies adjusted toward maximum growth rather than visual balance. The abdominal wall ceased to function as a limiting factor. The plot twist was counterintuitive. A feature once considered disqualifying became normalized through repeated validation. Bodybuilding did not openly endorse the look, but it rewarded it consistently enough to redefine acceptability. This moment marked a deeper change than aesthetics alone. It showed that bodybuilding standards could reverse without announcement, and that repeated judging decisions, not official statements, determined what was considered correct. Non-Olympia athletes become more influential than champions. Bodybuilding long operated under the assumption that competitive success determined influence. Titles, placements, and trophies were expected to define legacy. This model fractured when athletes without Mr. Olympia victories became more culturally impactful than reigning champions. Figures such as Mike Mentzer demonstrated that ideology, communication, and philosophy could outweigh contest results. Mentzer's competitive career was short and controversial, marked by disputes over judging and dissatisfaction with the direction of the sport. However, his influence expanded after competition ended. Through written work and public interviews, he articulated a training philosophy centered on high intensity, recovery, and efficiency. This framework directly challenged prevailing high-volume norms and reshaped how generations of lifters approached training. The shift revealed a structural vulnerability. Competitive bodybuilding rewarded physiques on specific days, but it did not monopolize authority over ideas. Athletes who articulated systems, narratives, or critiques reached wider audiences than champions who relied solely on stage success. Media platforms amplified this effect, allowing non-winners to shape discourse without institutional endorsement. The plot twist was hierarchical, influence detached from official ranking. An athlete could lose, retire, or never win, and still define how the sport was practiced and discussed globally. Championships determined titles, but they no longer controlled relevance. This moment marked a reordering of power. Bodybuilding's cultural center moved away from the judging panel and toward those who could explain, question, and reinterpret the sport itself. Social media rewrites who actually holds power. Before social media, authority in bodybuilding flowed almost entirely through federations, judges, and major magazines. Visibility depended on contest placements and editorial approval. This structure fractured as platforms like Instagram and YouTube allowed athletes to reach audiences directly, bypassing traditional gatekeepers. Influence became measurable through followers, engagement, and reach rather than trophies. Athletes who placed outside the top tier began securing sponsorships, media attention, and financial stability without winning major titles. Their value to brands came from visibility and relatability, not judging outcomes. Meanwhile, some elite competitors with high placements but limited online presence struggled to monetize their success beyond prize money. This shift altered incentive structures. Training content, physique updates, lifestyle access, and educational material became more valuable than competitive secrecy. Athletes optimized physiques for year-round appearance rather than a single contest peak. Consistency and marketability replaced exclusivity. The plot twist was economic. Competitive success stopped being the primary driver of career sustainability. Social media algorithms, not judges, determined who remained relevant. A competitor could lose repeatedly on stage yet gain financial leverage through audience connection, while champions risked obscurity if they failed to maintain visibility. This change reduced the practical authority of federations. While titles still conferred prestige, they no longer guaranteed influence or income. Power shifted from centralized institutions to distributed audiences, permanently altering how bodybuilding careers were built, maintained, and measured. The health narrative collapses under medical reality. For decades, professional bodybuilding was publicly framed as an extreme but controllable extension of fitness. Athletes emphasized discipline, diet, training precision, and knowing your body, reinforcing the idea that risks were manageable with experience. This narrative unraveled as medical explanations for long-term competitors became unavoidable and increasingly consistent. Clinical discussions revealed patterns that could not be dismissed as individual error. Chronic cardiac enlargement, left ventricular hypertrophy, impaired kidney filtration, altered lipid profiles, and sustained hypertension appeared repeatedly among high-level athletes. These outcomes were not tied to single substances or isolated mistakes. They reflected cumulative exposure to sustained mass, pharmacology, and metabolic strain. What made this a plot twist was timing. These issues often manifested after competitive success, not during obvious decline. Athletes who appeared dominant on stage presented with advanced internal damage while still actively competing or shortly after retirement. The visual markers of peak condition masked underlying dysfunction. Despite wider awareness, institutional messaging did not change. Health checks were not integrated into qualification systems. Judging did not penalize high-risk physiques, and official guidance remained minimal. Responsibility was placed on individuals rather than structures. The collapse was conceptual. Bodybuilding could no longer credibly present itself as an extreme form of health, while rewarding outcomes known to correlate with organ stress and reduced lifespan. The sport did not deny the data. It simply continued operating alongside it, separating performance evaluation from medical consequence. Women's bodybuilding is removed, then quietly rewritten. Women's bodybuilding followed a different competitive logic than the men's division, but it encountered a similar structural plot twist: elimination without collapse. For decades, female competitors were judged on muscularity, conditioning, and symmetry under standards that steadily escalated. As physiques grew more muscular, public perception and sponsor comfort declined, even as competitive quality increased. In 2014, the Ms. Olympia was abruptly removed from the Olympia weekend. No replacement pathway was offered, and no clear performance-based justification was provided. The official explanation centered on marketability rather than competition integrity. Athletes who had trained for years at the highest level were left without a pinnacle event. The removal did not reduce participation. Instead, it fragmented the sport. New divisions such as physique and bikini were elevated, each with tightly controlled aesthetic limits. Muscularity ceilings were enforced implicitly through judging outcomes rather than explicit rules. The message was not written, but it was enforced. Development beyond a certain point would no longer be rewarded. Years later, women's bodybuilding returned, but under altered expectations. The division existed again, yet its cultural weight was diminished. Prize money, visibility, and institutional support lagged behind other categories. The competitive pathway was restored without restoring status. The plot twist was organizational. Women's bodybuilding was not rejected for competitive reasons, then revived for competitive reasons. It was removed and reinstated based on market control. The division survived, but its autonomy and authority within the sport were permanently reduced. Athletes weren't about the system only after leaving it. Throughout bodybuilding history, critical warnings about judging politics, health risks, and structural incentives rarely come from active competitors. Instead, They emerge after athletes retire, lose relevance, or exit the competitive system entirely. This timing is not accidental. While competing, athletes depend on federations, judges, sponsors, and promoters for access and income. Public criticism risks exclusion. Once removed from active competition, former athletes speak more freely. They describe pressure to escalate size regardless of long-term health, to follow unspoken pharmaceutical norms, and to accept inconsistent judging without explanation. These accounts often align across generations, indicating structural patterns rather than isolated experiences. The plot twist lies in delayed truth. The information was always present but suppressed by dependency. Athletes who warned others earlier were dismissed as bitter or uncompetitive. When the same warnings came from multiple retired figures, they were reframed as hard truths rather than excuses. Importantly, these revelations did not reverse institutional behavior. Fans gained insight, but judging criteria and qualification pathways remained unchanged. The system absorbed criticism without reform, treating disclosure as commentary rather than a mandate for change. This pattern revealed a core dynamic. Bodybuilding rewarded compliance during participation and honesty after irrelevance. Athletes were incentivized to remain silent until speaking no longer carried consequences. The warnings arrived too late to protect those still climbing, reinforcing the cycle rather than disrupting it. Bodybuilding cannot return to its golden age. Calls to restore bodybuilding to an earlier era have persisted for decades. Fans reference periods defined by tighter midsections, clearer judging narratives, and physiques perceived as more sustainable. These appeals assume that standards can be reversed through preference alone. Structural reality contradicts this belief. Modern bodybuilding operates under incentives that did not exist in earlier eras. Qualification systems reward extreme mass. Sponsorship economics favor visual impact, and pharmaceutical knowledge has permanently expanded performance ceilings. Once these factors entered the system, they became embedded. Removing them would require coordinated rule enforcement, judging penalties, and economic restructuring, none of which exist. Judging panels are not tasked with preserving historical aesthetics. They reward comparative superiority under current norms. Athletes who voluntarily downsize or prioritize longevity place themselves at an immediate competitive disadvantage. As a result, even competitors who personally prefer older standards are compelled to conform to modern expectations to remain viable. The plot twist is finality. The golden age is not inaccessible due to resistance. It is inaccessible because the system no longer supports its requirements. Standards evolve through repeated validation, not explicit decisions. Reversing them would require deliberate rejection of physiques that currently win. Bodybuilding did not abandon its past. It outgrew it structurally. The sport now advances along a path shaped by incentives, not nostalgia. Calls for reversal misunderstand the nature of institutional momentum and why once a standard is rewarded, it becomes permanent.